I hesitated a lot before making this video because I know this is a sensitive topic right now. Anti-immigration sentiment has been rising globally. In Europe, surveys show growing skepticism toward immigration, especially among younger people. When Japan's ruling Conservative Party recently elected Sani Takachi as its new leader, I saw a lot of people in the dissident KOL community celebrating the news. Takachi is known for, at least in our community, having a really tough stance on immigration. It kind of reminded me of that joke that immigrants don't want more immigrants. And honestly, there's some truth to it. So instead of brushing them off, I want to explore why they feel this way. If you're new here, my name's Lu and I'm an authoritarian regime survivor. Like many ordinary people living in China, I was subject to sophisticated, intense brainwashing education at the age of 6. About 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to get out there and get an education before working as a reporter here in Canada. In a way, I was the typical case of millions of people who immigrated to North America from an authoritarian regime. I am naturally rooted in the diaspora community here, but this video is not really about whether immigration is a good thing or a bad thing for the country receiving them. I want to talk about something that rarely gets talked about, and that is the immigrants' perspective. Especially the first-gen immigrants who grew up under authoritarian regimes. What do people like me, who've already made the move, actually think about immigration? It's easy to have a black and white stance on immigration, but few people actually take the time to understand the immigrants that they're bringing in. A lot of the ignorance comes from not knowing how people from an authoritarian regime socialize, or what it's really like to grow up in an authoritarian regime. Brainwashing starts really early, and it plays a really irreplaceable role in shaping how we think about society, power, and authority. I discussed this a little bit in my earlier videos. Compassion and humanity were not encouraged, obedience was. There's also an emphasis on hierarchy. The higher up you are in that system, the more you are likely to live like an actual human. And everybody who are on the bottom of that hierarchy don't really get to live as a full human. There's also that absolute central party that everybody has to pledge loyalty to, and sacrifice or violence are justified because of that. But I also want to emphasize it's not just intense, it's also very sophisticated. They won't tell you you're not allowed to have compassion or humanity or a different political party. What they will tell you is your sacrifice or the violence that's used to protect the party is actually sovereignty, and hatred towards democracy, or what they call the West, is wrapped in the language of anti-colonialism, a buzzword that sounds progressive, especially to many on the left in the West. And that kind of mindset doesn't just disappear when we leave the country. In fact, a lot of us walk around, live our life without even knowing what was done to us. I think in a way we had to relearn everything. Here's a simple fact that gets overlooked by a lot of people. For people like me, we're dissidents. We left our country because there's something about our home country that we don't like, but not all of us think that way. Last year at Berklee College of Music in Boston, a Chinese student named Wu Xiaolei was sentenced to 9 months in prison for stalking and threatening another female Chinese student. The threats that Wu made were quite graphic and very relentless. He threatened to chop her hand off. Wu also told the female victim that he had reported her to the Chinese authority. Apparently, Wu was working with his mom. They said that the Chinese Communist Party would pay her family in China a visit. So all the victim did was that she posted flyers calling for freedom and democracy in China. And I remember watching a clip from that trial. The judge was clearly confused.
Why do you care if she goes back or she posts or doesn't post?
Because what she posts kind of like damage the reputation of the international student from China.
And that clip really stuck with me. I think when I watched that clip, I realized how many people in the West truly don't understand what is the connection between what the student said and his behavior. It just sounds very bizarre to them. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, this is probably just an individual case. It doesn't really represent the community here. I honestly wish that was true. But the fact is, when you are subject to a systematic brainwashing education at a young age, it is almost a miracle to break out of it, which is why in the diaspora community here, like if I want to connect with my local community here, I feel a little scared because sometimes these 同乡会, hometown associations, are filled with pro-CCP immigrants. There has been reports on how they would praise the Chinese Communist Party. They sing songs that praise their homeland. It's kind of a dog whistle for prison authoritarian regimes. And because these associations are kind of closed off from the outside world, while it has been going on ever since I came here, that type of activities only came under spotlight in recent years. And I bet there are still many people here living in Canada are not aware of that. So other than the worship of authoritarian regimes and the lack of acknowledgement on freedom of speech, I think there's also a lack of understanding of independence aside from the government. I remember when I was a Chinese student, it honestly took me such a long time to realize that student unions should be independent from the government. Because in China, of course, the student union works for the government. That's like, I don't even know, like it's just, it's as normal as breathing for me. All the Chinese student unions, they're all in contact with Chinese embassies. They listen to the embassies. And I never thought that the people who were at the associations, the students who were working with the government, were doing anything abnormal. And I think a lot of people in the West, they look at the Chinese student unions, they will never think that it's a default for the student union to obey the government. Another thing that really scares me is the bullying. I think bully is such a Western word. It doesn't even begin to explain under this hierarchy mindset what is happening between the powerful and the less powerful. A few years ago in Rowland Heights, California, a group of Chinese international students attacked another girl. They beat her, they burnt her with cigarettes, they forced her to eat her own hair. It was a very shocking case. I remember a lot of people were quite shocked by what happened. But I remember at the time when I was reading the news, I thought that's such a common thing in China. I think the key difference here is there's bullying in school everywhere. But I think the severity, just how cruel it can be, and also there's a general tolerance towards this. And all these people, their parents don't necessarily think their kids did anything wrong. Okay, that's very heavy. I guess what I'm trying to say is the transnational oppression, of course, it starts from the government, the authoritarian government, but I think it's naive to deny that it's cooperated by a lot of immigrants abroad. And I think there's a blind confidence among the democracies. They're so optimistic about their own power of democracy. They think that once people get out of their little bubble, once they come here, they would naturally change. Everybody talks about the impact that democracy has on authoritarian regimes. Nobody really predicted the reverse. Nobody really thought about what authoritarian alliances can do to democracies. I think it's easy to chant pro-immigration, but it's hard to uphold your democratic values in the process. And it's dissidents like us who bear the brunt of the ignorance.